God willing, we'll be meeting in person. All right, here we
Let's do
go.
it. All right. Yeah, just to give like a brief orientation and I guess words of introduction. This idea kind of like was percolating in my head for a while. We have a great community here, and a great chevra. So to kind of mix that with Torah is incredible. And we have an amazing opportunity with Rabbi Kurtz in town. I actually Rabbi Kurtz, right before he came to Stanford, was at the Young Israel of Plainview. So I'm from Plainview, and I've listened to him there. He's very dynamic, incredible. And I was very, very pleased that he was coming right over Long Island Sound, pretty much on the same longitude to Stanford. So it's great. So we're really happy to have you, and thank you. So yeah, the idea basically I kind of explained in that initial message was like we'll meet every 2 weeks, and it's basically we have the guys in the community have a diverse range of interests, and with Rabbi Kurtz here, we can kind of feel free to explore the the corpus of Judaism, the topics that you're interested in through the lens of Judaism, to get a better understanding of it, and a better understanding of our own Yiddishkeit and our own tradition at the same time. So moral questions, halachic questions, and add an element to it is that Rabbi Kurtz has offered to. It'll be very happy to work with guys if they want to kind of develop their Hebrew interpretation skills, Hebrew language skills, to work through some of the sources, or for those who can do it on their own, they're more than welcome to kind of give a shir. And Rabbi Kurtz is going to be could be like a Torah coach. So if there's a particular topic that you're interested in, to gain kind of ownership over it, you can work through a few sources with Rabbi Kurtz, and then I think it would really be cool to have one of us, every so often, give over the shir, give over whatever topic we're interested in. So that's kind of like the general orientation. So for our inaugural session, Rabbi Kurtz is gonna take it away on a very interesting topic. Thank you, Rabbi.
Yeah, Sam, thanks so much for the introduction. So what I was thinking is, and I want to echo what Sam is saying, I'm going to give this inaugural Chabura, let's call it right now for all of us. But the idea really is this isn't just like another class on my schedule that I teach, but the idea is that we really want to invite all of you to volunteer to give a Chabura at some point. And that's only for everyone's own good. If you just don't feel like, you just benefit from listening, you're not interested in giving, we're not going to twist your arm for that. But as a Chabura, I think it'd be very beneficial that if there's a topic you're interested in researching, so if you feel fully capable on your own to go ahead and research and it's not an issue, beautiful, wonderful, and we'd love to hear. And if you want to research a topic and you feel like you can use a little help either navigating the sources, putting it together in any way, I'm here to offer my time and services if I could be of help. But essentially, this is a Chabura where hopefully the topics really are what interest us collectively. But so I'm going to pick a topic right now that has been on my mind for a while. And Ari, I think you got a very brief preview of it before, which is I really, one of my goals in general is that when I look into the world, and I see all the different discussions that are going on in contemporary discourse. It could be political, it could be within the Jewish community, the broader world. I ask myself, what would God want from us in those situations? So something that's been part of our discourse for the past, especially most recent years, is the idea of political correctness, which essentially the scenario, the term itself has a negative connotation, because it's essentially saying that I'm only going to use certain terminology in order so that I don't get booed off the stage. So here's the scenario, very simple scenario. Ruvain makes a comment, just a normal conversation, and he uses a terminology that Shimon finds offensive, that Shimon finds causes him distress. Is it incumbent upon Ruvain to switch the terminology he's using in order to accommodate Shimon's sensitivities? And I'll give a few examples just so it's concrete. One example, we'll start off with something very less politically charged, which is if Reuven was saying a special needs child, and Shimon said, no, you should say person first. You should say a child with special needs. So is Shimon obligated to change the way he's talking to fit the sensitivities of the second party? And then secondly, we could go up in a scenario. For instance, I'm not even sure today what is considered appropriate, but my understanding, at least over the past few years, is that it's more acceptable in contemporary discourse to use the term African American instead of Black. Right? It might be person of color at this point. I guess I'm a good example myself. I'm losing track. So if Ruvain uses the term Black and Shimon says, no, you should use the term African American or person of color, is it incumbent upon Ruvain to change the terminology he's using to accommodate him? And then one more example that I want to bring up, which is we're going to see is different, is let's say, this is something else that I'm noticing nowadays, which is instead of using the term husband or wife, there's a more gender neutral term that's going around, which is partner. And what partner does is it accommodates at least two different kinds of unions, either a same-sex union or it accommodates a man and woman, but they're not married to each other. They're living as boyfriend and girlfriend together in the same apartment. So both of those unions, for different reasons, are very likely not sanctioned by the Torah for their independent reasons. So if someone wants me to use the term partner instead of husband or wife, am I supposed to be accommodating that if they feel offended or distressed by the fact that I'm using a term that doesn't suit their sensitivities? So before I have a source sheet I'm going to share on the screen momentarily, and it was in the calendar invite as well if you want to access it on your own and look through it. What are our general impressions? What would Judaism want from us in these kind of scenarios? Is it really incumbent upon Ruvain to accommodate Shimon's sensitivities? Or does Shimon need to be understanding that not everyone's going to speak the way that he prefers, and that's just not expected for Ruvain to anticipate that or to care about that? What are our general impressions before we jump into the halachic literature on the topic? I guess, just one other point of introduction, I guess that's important, is that, we're all here to discuss Torah, so we could all take opposing decisions, but we're all here in order to understand the Divrei Elokim Chaim. So it's, if you take a position that's more right-wing or left-wing, the way we would portray it in modern day discourse, I think, as a group together, I hope that we can be all comfortable sharing opinions that might not be popular as long as we do it in a way that we're just trying to speak logically and have a reasonable discussion. So what would just be your general impression if you were Ruvain and someone told you to change the way you speak in order to accommodate certain sensitivities? Would you change it or would you not?
So I would think, why not? It doesn't bother me to call someone, they don't want me to call them Black or African American or person of color. Great, I'll call them that. It really doesn't affect my life. I don't get the big deal.
Right. So from your perspective, Daniel, you're saying is that, okay, so I change a few terms. It makes him happy. I can move on with my life. What's the difference?
Right. It's really no effort on my part. It doesn't change my life. So, if it makes him happy, why not?
So so Daniel, Baruch Hashem, we have people who are very agreeable who don't want to start any fights. But what if, I personally probably have a little less patience than you do. And what if I get a little frustrated about constantly being corrected about the way I speak? It's not a one-time thing, but it's a more consistent thing. Should that be incumbent upon me to change the way I talk? Does anyone else want to take a different position than Daniel? Yes, John.
I think, then the other question might be, are you changing the way you speak, generally, or when you speak with, just Shimon, maybe you use different terminology if it's just one-on-one because you know that Shimon will take offense. But again, your general perspective is not necessarily changing, but just in order to avoid either hurting his feelings or honestly avoid getting into a conflict, you just sort of do what he wants to hear. But again, when you're in other circles, you use the more common terminology.
Right. So that's an important distinction you bring up, John, which is that the case I'm outlining is really just between two individuals. But the reason I bring this up is because this is a broader cultural phenomenon where you'll have people from different cultural perspectives in the US who might be accustomed to speaking one way, but not another way. So, I mean, I think obviously, going back to the Black versus African American example, there's no question you cannot use something like the N-word because that's clearly done out of malicious intentions. So the only question is that what if I use a term which to me is a neutral terminology, but someone else doesn't view it as such? So let's jump into the sources, and then we could get a more in-depth idea of how this works.
Rabbi, one more point I wanted to make that I think would weigh on me is the intention, right, of the person. That like sometimes there's correcting somebody to like, but you actually like legitimately want them to understand your point of view. And like I feel like in a lot of political discourse today, it's to correct them, to basically like show them up, right, and make yourself seem superior. That's something for me that would at least weigh into the potential decision.
So if I understand, the scenario that you're describing is when I basically want to feel ethically or morally superior, so I will put you down by saying that you're not speaking the right way. That way I could kind of give myself an ego boost over you at your expense. Is that what you're describing?
Yeah, essentially.
Okay, so that's something I hope to address toward the end of the class, because you're right. The way I'm portraying the scenario is that the question is the onus on Reuven to reform the way he speaks. But the question, it sounds like there's no responsibility on Shimon's end. So what you're bringing up is something that Goblin will get to toward the end, which is, wait a minute, what about Shimon? Sometimes, I'll just bring this up now because you're bringing it up. Sometimes the person who is initially offended, when they respond to the initial commenter, the initial speaker, and they rebuke them and humiliate them publicly for it, it's many times much more, it's like a disproportionate response that causes much greater distress and humiliation to the person who initially made that comment, perhaps unwittingly and not aware of what the results that he was causing. So your point's well taken on that. Okay, let's look at a few sources. So what is the Isser? What is the prohibition in the Torah of causing someone distress? So we could actually, if we go to Vayikra, the pasuk says, "Lo sanu ishas hamisov v'yaresim l'kecha ki ani Adonai lehechem." So something we might be familiar with is called Ona'as mamon. Ona'as mamon means that if I overcharge you 1/6 more than a product is worth, and you're not aware of that, that is called Ona'as mamon. That's a form of wronging someone monetarily. But if we go a few psukim later to this verse over here, verse number 17, if we look here, there's another mentioning also of below sonu, that you shall not wrong someone from your nation. So what the rabbis do in the Gemara is they figure out, if we look at the Mishnah in Bava Kama, Kishem she'ona b'mekach u'memkar kach ona b'dvarim. The same way you could wrong someone in business, you could also wrong them with words. The examples given in the Mishnah range from, it could be if you trick someone that you're interested in their product. Another example is, let's say someone's a Baal Tshuva. They repented from their non-observant or from their sinful ways, and now they are fully practicing the word of God. So if you tell them, Zechor ma'asecha harishonim, remember back in the day you committed all those sins, that causes them distress, and that is prohibited because there's a prohibition called Ona'as Devarim, which is the prohibition of causing emotional distress to another party, to another person. And the same idea comes up if someone converted to Judaism. If you tell them, remember what you and your parents used to do before you were Jewish, and you humiliate them that way, that is also a form of Ona'as Devarim, causing someone distress. In fact, the Gemara tells us that Amar Rav Yochanan, Mishum Rav Shimon ben Yochai, Gadol Onas Devarim Me'onas Mamon. If I were to ask you what's worse, causing verbal harm or causing monetary harm, I would say, well, monetary is more tangible, it's more quantifiable. But no, the Gemara tells us that causing verbal harm, which has no physical ramifications, is considered worse than damages through monetary ona. And the examples it gives us is one, if you look in the verse here, it says, Ve'eresa melokecha, you should fear the Lord your God. It doesn't say that when it comes to money. Then also it tells us, Rabbi Lezer Omer, Zeb gufo v'zeb mamono. One you do with your money, but one you do with your actual body itself when you humiliate or cause someone distress. And then finally, Rabbi Shmuel bar Nachmani Amar, Zeh nitein li shavon v'zeh lo nitein li shavon. That money could always be returned. But once someone causes distress to another human being, that is not something that's returnable. That is not something that can easily be rectified. So this is the locus classicus of the principle of Onas Devarim rabbinic literature, the prohibition of causing another human being distress. And what comes out from this Gemara is that it's a very important mitzvah. It's not something that, you hear halacha shiurim on so often, but it's considered more. We spend a lot of time talking about bava kama. We talk about all these cases of torts and damages. At least that's what yeshivas spend a lot of time doing. Meanwhile, harming someone's words is considered more severe than harming them monetarily, according to this Gemara.
Rabbi, so it's basically an isser on bullying, is essentially like lo sonu. If you would kind of translate it literally, do not cause angst, or don't. I don't know how you would translate it literally, but it comes out more as like bullying.
Absolutely, I completely agree with that assessment, Sam, and that's the difference between this and lashon hara. You see, a lashon hara and onas devarim, they kind of are two sides of the same coin. Lashon hara is is speaking ill of someone, speaking that causes harm behind that person's back. But onas devarim is something that you do to someone's face. It's something that you do to them directly. So bullying is a great example of that, where the typical case of bullying, it could be behind someone's back, but the typical, you watch a movie and there's like the classic bully in the school, that in addition to physical harm also causes verbal abuse. This would be the prohibition against causing some form of verbal abuse. In fact, though, it's not just bullying, though. It could be even something more subtle. So imagine I go to someone's Shabbos table and, let's say they know that I never learned a particular Masechta or I didn't learn a particular area of Torah. The Rambam says, Nishal Ashela Dvar Chachma, Lo Yomar L'misha Ino Yodea Osa Chachma Ma Tosh B'davar Zeh O Ma Daitcha B'davar Zeh. Let's say I never learned the topic of, this would be ironic. I never learned the topic of Onas Devarim. Then you start asking me in public, you start quizzing me, so how do the halachas of Onas Devarim work? Do you have to reform the way you speak in order to accommodate someone else's sensitivities? And then I say, yeah, I'm sorry, I don't know the halachos. Well, that's a case of Onas Devarim. Because even doing something as subtle, indirect as just bringing out someone's lack of knowledge, and that causes a form of embarrassment, humiliation, and even something more subtle like that could fall under the category of Onas Devarim. So that's something that the Rambam and also in the Sefer Hasidim, they add on that idea. And it comes from a Gemara as well, the Or Sameach. It's not on the sheet, but the Or Sameach on the Rambam points out that there actually could be traced back to Gemara, where there was an Amora who was asked a question in Beis Medrash, and he said, why are you asking me this question in front of everyone? My Rebbeim, we know no one was able to figure out the answer to this. You're just trying to embarrass me here in public. So that's something important to keep in mind. Onas Devarim is very broad in the different kinds of applications and manifestations that it could have. And in fact, not only is it so broad in its potential application, but the consequences for it also are no laughing matter. According to the Mordechai, he says that when it comes to Onas Devarim, you actually, he says, Malkim Oso Shari Ovar Alav Gamor. You get bona fide Malchus. You get 39 lashes for causing Ona'as Devarim to someone, which is a crazy idea because most Rishonim, they say this is a lav she'ein bo maisa. Usually, in order to incur a physical corporal punishment, you need to do a physical action. Makes sense, right? Do physical sin, it's commensurate, you get a physical punishment. But so Ona'as Devarim is not physical. And that's why most Rishonim say you don't get Malchus. But there is a Shita of the Mordechai that goes so extreme as to say that even on a biblical level, you incur Malchus, you incur 39 lashes. So Ona'as Devarim isn't just something like, oh, he said something not nice to me, and then we ignore it. No, it actually, if there was a Beis Din around, it's possible, according to the Mordechai, at his Beis Din, they would give physical lashes to someone who is proven to have caused real bona fide Ona'as Devarim to another individual. So, I just wanted to bring these sources to your attention that when we're discussing the question of Ona'as Devarim, don't think it's just like, oh, this guy has bad midos, okay, now I can give a nice little Musar spiel about it, we could all smile and move on our way. No, it's like a real halachic isser, a real lav, a real prohibition, and has real consequences. So when we ask the question, going back to our question from before, am I allowed to, do I have to alter the way I speak? Do I not? It's not just a midos question. It's a real halachic question. And like any halachic sugya, we're going to have to figure out when do we say something is considered Ona'as Devarim, and when does it not constitute Ona'as Devarim? Because if you think about it, I mean, again, we may all be agreeable like Daniel to a certain extent, but if every day you're interacting with different people who are constantly telling you, I'll just speak for myself, are constantly telling me that, no, you should actually use that term. No, actually, that's not nice to that person. That's offensive. I'll be taken that way. It'll eventually drive me crazy. So for my own sake, at what point can I just put my foot down and say, look, this is the way I talk. You talk the way you want. I have my idiosyncrasies. You have your idiosyncrasies. Let's move on in life. So at what point can I put my foot down and say that? Or do I always just have to be beholden to whoever is going to feel that the term I use is offensive toward them? Any thoughts or questions before that was part number one? Okay.
Rabbi, so just looking at that Mordechai, so like the first line, Matzati Ruvain Toin al Shimon, initni bidvarim. So he goes to court and he says, basically, someone's been bothering me.
Right, and he brings witnesses. Right. So what he does is he brings witnesses who, now does he need hasra? We'd have to get into technicalities. Does he have to be warned beforehand? Does he have to do tokadei dibur? We'd have to ask, if all those qualifications apply or if they don't. But right, in order for Beis Din to give lashes, it would be reasonable that they need witnesses to corroborate that the action actually occurred. Or is there something there that's
No, it's just interesting that I think there's lawsuits that are filed nowadays, for harassment, in the workplace, discrimination, harassment. So this is, could be in some kind of this is very real.
So what you're saying is that today, if what would be the examples that come up in the workplace that people file lawsuits over?
Yeah. No, just today I was looking at something. Someone like an African American man who felt that he was being discriminated against because he applied for a position and they gave it to a Caucasian person, and there was obviously there was back and forth, but they feel discriminated against, so they filed a lawsuit, and it was a class action lawsuit. Anyone who's in my position who feels the way I do, as a certified class, we're suing this federal agency or this government because that's how I feel, and I assume others feel the same way. So they filed a lawsuit.
Right. So, right, these kind of things are happening today. I mean, I'm not in law, but I trust all of you who are in these fields and in the corporate setting to tell me this. But I think, also we've seen coming up as well, but not between just people of different ethnicities, but also the different genders. So if a man would make a comment to a woman, then certain things get classified as some form of verbal assault, and there's gray areas as to how to quantify that. So I think, right, so definitely in the corporate setting, there's been a whole reckoning about that in recent years. So that's definitely why a lot of this is on my mind, despite the fact I don't work in the corporate setting. But for those of you who do, are you seeing what Sam is referring to? Or we all just haven't been back to work in a while, so it's so we don't know what's going on. As long as we're happy on our computers, we're good. Okay.
But
So the
before we move
frontline
on,
worker, the labor.
What was that?
Go ahead.
Was
I mean,
John say something?
Yeah, I was going to ask something also. I was going to say, focusing on, if we actually look at the text of the Mordechai also, in terms of the Eidim, what are the Eidim coming to prove? Are they coming to prove the objective words being said, or the subjective experience that Shimon had from those words? Do the words have to be sort of objectively by the majority of society taken as offensive? Or again, is it sort of the subjective experience that, yes, we heard Reuven say to Shimon asking about his partner and not his spouse, not his wife. So again, that's sort of the other question there. It's not clear so far in terms of, are we looking sort of things that are objectively, and there's nothing, when we're talking about being insulted, it's hard to find a true objective, but that would be taken objectively as offensive to most people. Or again, or are we talking about a particular individual situation, or again, a minority situation?
Great. So thanks for bringing it up again, John. So these sources aren't on here, but I'll just fill us in. So when it comes to Ona'as Devarim, now the Mordechai might be a whole separate discussion about how Edom could quantify that. I agree with you. I think that's part of the difficulty in the Mordechai. But basically, based on Rashi, based on the Shulchan Aruch, based on a Gemara in Maseches Tainus. So in Tainus, it's talking about the milas, the qualities of different rabbis and why they merited to live long lives. So they asked one rabbi, and he listed a whole number of things. The final one was that I didn't call my friend by his nickname. So wait, if I go by a nickname and someone calls me that, is that an issue? Well, the Shulchan Aruch says only if he has kavana k'dei levayish, if he has intention to cause humiliation. And so that's the important factor that you're getting to, John, which is that there needs to be some form of kavana, some form of either awareness or intention to cause harm. And I want to basically dissect that right now, because if we could answer to what extent do you have to have kavana to cause harm to someone, we could basically answer this question. And what we need to distinguish is between, in English, awareness versus intent. Because I can be, and this is our case, I can be very well aware that using the term, let's say, one example was special needs child versus child with special needs. I could be aware that using the term special needs child would cause anguish, would cause distress to someone who's more sensitive to that. But, that's just the way I'm used to talking. That's how people around me talked growing up. So I don't intend to cause any form of emotional distress, but I'm aware that the way I talk will cause emotional distress. So the question is, if I'm aware that there is harm being caused by my words, but I don't intend to cause harm, is that problematic? And for those who are familiar with Hilchos Shabbos, a good analogy, I think, might be a psik reisha de lo ichbas le. A psik reisha de lo ichbas le is where, let's say I'm walking to shul on Shabbos, and I have to go through a busy store area, and the electric doors to one of the stores open up as I pass by. Or here, another good example. We have this in suburban neighborhoods over here, where people's garage lights turn on, the sensors turn on when you walk by on Shabbos. Now that's deserving of a shir into itself, but essentially one of the reasons that's taken into account why you could walk by is it's a psik reisha. I know that light's going to turn on when I'm walking home. I mean, assuming I'm not able to get out of the way or cross the street, no matter what I do. But we say it's the lo ichpasle. It doesn't make a difference to me. I don't care for that light to go on. The street lights, the street lights are perfect. I don't need it to see anything. So that's one of the leniencies that comes in, which is I'm aware that an action's happening because of me, but I don't intend for that action to happen. I couldn't care less about it. So in Hilchos Shabbos, there's a whole dispute if that is considered an Isser Malacha, if you violated Shabbos by doing that. So here there's a similar discussion too. If I'm aware that I'm causing harm, but I don't intend to cause harm, am I held accountable? Do I have to then accommodate and adapt the way I'm speaking in order to accommodate the second party? So here are just some paradigms.
Argument,
what was that?
sorry, I was saying, does that argument work in this case? Because like the case where you're turning a light on by mistake, there's no kind of second party, right? But in this case, you're aware that what you're saying is maybe offensive or whatever the term you want to use is, right? So you're aware about it. So then how can you say that you don't intend? I feel like the comparison doesn't really work here.
Right. So I think what you're bringing up also is in the psik reisha sugya. So if I say, right, psik reisha is I cut they used to back then, they didn't have basketballs or anything for the kids to play with, so they would cut the head of a chicken off, and then the kids would play with the head of a chicken. So that's where the term psik reisha, cutting the head, comes up. So one of the ideas that comes up is that I could say, well, I'm not trying to kill a chicken on Shabbos. I'm not trying to perform malacha by killing a chicken, which is shchita on Shabbos. I just want the head of the chicken. But we say you can't just go ahead and say that you're not intending to kill the chicken. Obviously, you're intending to kill the chicken when you're trying to get the head from it. So I think that might speak to your point a little bit, Daniel, which is that if you are aware that you're causing harm, how can you say you're not intending any form of malicious, you don't have any malicious intent? Is that the point you're getting at, or am I?
Right.
That is, okay. So
yeah.
Bring it back to the psik reisha sugya, your point is very well taken. So let me just to sharpen this idea, just so we understand the different, understand this question better. There are three different paradigms that I've identified. One paradigm is which I think is obvious, but just needs to be said, is where not only did I not intend any harm, but I'm not even aware that I'm causing harm. So that, and we're not going to go through the source right now, but if you look at Rav Gusman in Kontrusei Shirim, he says if you accidentally cause Ona'as mamon, monetary harm to someone, by overcharging them, sure, you need to return the money, but you don't need to do tshuva for it on Yom Kippur, because if you didn't intend to cheat them, then you didn't violate the prohibition of Ona'as mamon. So a similar idea comes up in the modern Sefer, L'Reach Kamocha, which also says if you're not even aware of the harm you're causing, then certainly you did not violate the prohibition. And then on the other extreme is the story of Penina and Chana in Sefer Shmuel in the book of Samuel. So there, in that story, so Chana and Penina are co-wives to Elkanah, and according to the rabbis in the Gemara, they say, Satan and Penina l'shem shemaim niskavnu. Satan and Penina had good intentions for their respective stories. Satan tested Job, in order so that Job wouldn't kick Avram off the pedestal of who was most beloved to God. And according to the opinion that Job was not Jewish, and then God wouldn't love the Jewish people anymore, leave that for another time. Penina was co-wives with Chana to Elkanah. Penina had children, and Chana did not. So what Penina did was she harassed Chana, she ridiculed her with the intention, with the hopes that out of the dismay and anguish, Chana would cry out to God, her prayers would be answered, and she would have a son, which indeed is what happened. And that's why we have Sefer Shmuel. If she never had a kid, we would never have the book, right? So, because her son was Shmuel. So, even though she had what you would call, she was aware of the pain she was causing, maybe she had some good long-term goals, but she intended to cause harm to Chana. So even if down the line it was going to help her have a kid, if she intended harm, then that is a violation of Ona'as Devarim. In fact, we're told by the rabbis, we're told by Chazal, that her children died prematurely during her own lifetime because of the sin of ridiculing and causing extreme Ona'as Devarim to Chana. So that's the other extreme where not only am I aware of causing harm, but I'm even intending. I have malicious intent to cause harm. But then there's a case in the middle, which is what we're really getting at. And I think, if I had to find a source for trigger warnings in the Gemara, I was looking around. This is really the best I can do, and you'll tell me if you think that this could serve as a source. The Gemara says, V'hainu da'amri inshi, there's a saying, but it's codified by the Gemara, so the rabbis seem to agree with it. That if a family has a record, it's recorded that they remember having a relative get hanged, they were executed by hanging. Lo nemale, you shouldn't tell them in casual conversation, don't say to your friend, zakiv beinesa, don't go ahead and hang up a fish. Now here, you're having a very casual conversation. You said, oh, can you just hang the fish up over there? I'm not sure why they're hanging a fish. Maybe, I don't know what you do with fishes to hang them up, but maybe they're just they caught a trout and they were putting it up on the wall to display. They were very happy about that, about their hunt that day. So don't even say hang in a conversation that has nothing to do with execution or hanging of a relative. Why? Rashi says G'nai, because you're reminding them of the shame of their family. But maybe this is anachronistic of me. You'll tell me if you buy it. But I think it also is because you're evoking trauma. You're evoking a memory of a traumatic experience. No doubt it is traumatic for a family to have a relative of that have a family member be executed. I would imagine. All I did was major in psychology, so I can't really pontificate on psychology, but I would assume that could constitute a traumatic experience. So you have to be so careful not to evoke any form of distress or trauma that you can't even say, you shouldn't even use the word hanging, even in a conversation about hanging up food for dinner. That's how far this Gemara is telling you to go to be sensitive to the needs of someone else. Now, do you buy my interpretation of the Gemara? I put translation down there for anyone who wants to see that as well. Do you buy my interpretation of the Gemara? Is it anachronistic? Am I just trying to fit this into trigger warnings? And do you think that this would answer our case where Ruvain uses a term that Shimon doesn't like? Does Ruvain now need to accommodate the sensitivities of Shimon based on this Gemara? What would you say?
The Gemara seems, it almost sounds like the Gemara is being comical, though. I mean, it's almost like an extreme. It sounds like the common TV trope that we've all seen on a sitcom where there are a bunch of white people and suddenly a black person enters and they're all scared to use the word black, in terms of, oh, what about that black t-shirt you're wearing? They won't say it. And it's like a joke, a running joke. I just saw it on Community on Netflix recently. So, it seems almost like an extreme that not to be taken seriously. But again, with just this line of the Gemara, I can't really claim that that's where it's going.
Right. It's a very difficult line to decode, and I tried looking through the Mefarshim. Other than Rashi, I really did not find anyone commenting on this line. And I'll just point also, something that makes my argument a little weaker is that it's V'hainu da'amri inshi. It's a phrase that people say. The Gemara happens to quote it. Now, the Gemara, by quoting it, seems to agree with it, but the Gemara does that a lot where it'll quote phrases, as they say in common parlance. That was like an expression that people used back then. So the question is how literally we could take that. But if we do take it literally, that would be something to take into consideration. However, one other qualification I'm going to make is that if you buy my interpretation, this is talking about trauma. I think it's important, and this is something that you see today sometimes, at least I've noticed, where people will conflate trauma with being offended, which is very problematic because, trauma is a real mental health problem that people have to deal with who have suffered that. So to say that I suffered a trauma by hearing a term that I disagree with or hearing a political position I disagree with, that cheapens what trauma is for people who actually suffered from that. And I think that's what the Gemara is talking about. The Gemara is talking about someone who suffered an actual traumatic experience. And there you're expected to go out of your way to help them, to be sensitive to them. But to someone who is just offended by a term that you use, it is not clear to me from this Gemara that you would have to accommodate and be overly sensitive to the needs of that particular individual. So that's my interpretation of that Gemara. But it sounds like from here, if we were, we're getting toward the end of our time, I think. So let me just speed things up a little bit. It sounds like from here that if I intend to offend someone, right? Let's say I know that they don't like me using that word. I know they're going to be offended. I just want to, stick it to them anyway. So that would be Ona'as Devarim. It sounds like I could, and unequivocally, it's Ona'as Devarim. If you intend to harm to someone verbally, that constitutes Ona'as Devarim. Done. However, there are certain people that while that might be Ona'as Devarim, there are certain people that don't merit the protection of Ona'as Devarim. Meaning, Ona'as Devarim is not just a limitation on me not to use Ona'as Devarim. It's a protection for someone who would be on the receiving end of Ona'as Devarim. And not everyone is privileged to receive that protection that you're not allowed to, that you would not be allowed to say Ona'as Devarim to those individuals. There are some people who are an exception to that rule. The Ramah says, we are only commanded for when it comes to people who are Yirei Hashem, those who fear God. And we're just going to skip a little bit just to keep the essence of the discussion intact. So what does it mean someone who doesn't fear God? Meaning what? If I showed up to Minyan late one day, does that mean I don't fear God anymore? What do I have to do to no longer be considered a Yirei Hashem? So when I asked this to someone else, they told me, if you commit maybe one of the 3 cardinal sins, that shows you're not fearing God. Or maybe if you publicly violate Shabbos, at least from a traditional understanding, before the modern era, then that also shows that you're not a God-fearing individual. Does anyone know what you have to do in order to not be considered God-fearing? So I'll tell you. It's less so about the particular sin, but more about why you're committing that sin. The Chavetz Chaim quoting, it's based on Rabbeinu Yonah really in Shari Tshuva, which I guess is a good thing I'm bringing it up, so I could say it's thematically connected to Rosh Hashanah coming up. There's your connection if you were looking for it. This is just a good topic. It doesn't need to be thematically related. Anyway, the Chavetz Chaim says, when someone sins, he's talking about people you're allowed to say Lashon Hara about, and also Ona'as Devarim about. Sometimes we sin. The classic example that every Rebbe I had used is like you walk into McDonald's, you eat a cheeseburger. It's the best example because if you don't want anyone to get offended, that way no one really is offended by you telling them to keep kosher. Even in more general pluralistic settings, people aren't usually offended by the notion of you keeping kosher. So that'll be my go-to for tonight, in order so I am sensitive. Anyway, if you sin because you had a taiva, you had a temptation, and you gave in to temptation, that's okay. You got to do tshuva for that, but no one's perfect. When you and I sin, we sin because we gave in to temptation. We gave in because we weren't strong enough to keep that particular mitzvah. And that's a normal thing that happens to every single person, no matter how devout and observant they are. At some point, they'll sin, probably because they gave in to temptation. However, there are those who give in. There are those who they walk without a fear of God in their hearts, without a fear of God in their eyes. Those people, those kind of people, you could ridicule them whether behind their back with Lashon Hara or to their face with Ona'as Devarim. Why? Because if someone sins in principle, meaning if I say, you know what, I just really need to eat that cheeseburger, I'm really hungry today, and I eat it, okay, so I'll have to do tshuva for that. That's not a joking matter still, but that's different than if I say, you know what, I don't get this whole point about meat and milk and all these other rules, so I'm going to eat the cheeseburger because it doesn't make sense to me, and God has no right to tell me to do something that doesn't make sense to me, which defeats the purpose of listening to Torah because you will do what only makes sense to you otherwise. Anyway, if you do that, if you sin out of principle, then that is actual kfira. That is an actual rejection of God, and that's what puts you in the category of someone who is not a Yirei Hashem, someone who does not fear the word of God. Because someone who sins otherwise, they fear the word of God, they just gave into temptation. But someone who in principle rejects a mitzvah, that makes him a mumar lahachis, not a mumar l'teyavon, someone who sins in spite in principle. And that fits into the Gemara. I didn't quote it over here, but the Gemara Bava Metzia says, if you look back at our first source in the pasuk, Losono ish es amiso. You see how I bolded amiso? The Gemara tells us anyone who's not part of amiso, someone who's not your fellow, someone who's not part of the Jewish people, the Jewish nation, does not get protected by Ona'as Devarim. So where does that leave us? Well, before I was talking about, special needs kid versus kid with special needs, black versus African American, person of color, etc. But what if someone is telling me to use a terminology that gives credence to a belief that is against the Torah? So again, maybe you guys could think of a better example than I can, but when I was putting this together, this is just what came to mind. I'm sure there's a better example than this, so you'll tell me. So if someone is adamant that you're not allowed to use the term husband and wife, but you have to use the term partner in order to accommodate unions that are against the Torah, so then there are two possible issues here. One is that you have to start considering, maybe I could sin l'te'avon, I could sin out of pleasure, I could sin out of temptation. But the moment I start advocating that a certain sin is permissible, let's say I could be okay with, being accommodating to a man and woman who are living together who aren't married, right? I could treat them nicely. I could welcome them to the community. It's what we do. That's what we do at Agudat Shalom. We're all happy and welcoming. But if I go ahead and I advocate that men and women should be able to live together as sexual partners without being married, then that's me taking a stand in principle against something that's prohibited in the Torah. That falls under the sin of prostitution, actually. So once I start advocating, and if I'm advocating against a Torah principle, that takes me out of the realm of amisecha, and it takes me out of the realm of the protection of Ona'as Devarim. So what happens today in modern discourse is if someone is asking me to use terminology that is accommodating to an ideology that is against the Torah, then I do not have to actually accommodate their sensitivity. In fact, it might be imperative actually that I ignore that. Now, there might be a more obvious example that some of you are thinking of that I'm deliberately not bringing up, and that is misgendering. And the reason I do not bring up misgendering as an example is because there's actually a halakhic dispute if someone who goes through a transitional surgery changes their gender halakhically. Most authorities don't believe it works. They believe that the sex that you're born with is the sex you have all your life, no matter what you do. There is a minority position of Tzitz Eliezer that's based on whatever your outside genitalia are. That's how we are kovea, how we determine halacha. So I think there's actually a basis. This is for another separate shiur, that if someone wants you to call them by a particular gender, and they've gone through a transitional surgery, and that's now they have male genitalia or female genitalia, then I don't think you could use the argument I just made to say, well, I'm going to stand up for the Torah and I'm going to call you by the gender you're born with, because here there's actually a halakhic position that can be relied upon. It's only when it is clear that someone is advocating for a position that has no halakhic credibility, and I ask you to use terminology that is accommodating to that ideology that is antithetical to the Torah, are they not protected by Ona'as Devarim? And is it imperative that you just use terms that are in line with the dictates of the Torah?
But shouldn't there also be consideration for Chil Hashem, with insensitivity? So, right. For example, even in that most lenient approach, that's after there's been a transitional surgery. But again, at least I could assure you that in sort of academic institutions, people have, in a box like this, we would have after our name he, his, him, and basically, it's sort of accepted in younger cohorts of people nowadays, where if you don't honor those sort of ways that people want to be addressed, you look like a bigot. And again, if you're doing it for Torah reasons, you're bringing the Torah with you. So, should that also be an additional consideration that, we have to sort of be mindful that people should also look upon the Torah as a sensitive document and something that strives for, as society would see goodness. Again, it's not like, it's a little bit different in that, we want the Torah to be viewed as something that people aspire to and not sort of something as so old-fashioned that it's insensitive to people's feelings.
Right. So this is actually a question I had because 3 years ago, I did a rabbinical student fellowship with the Shalom Hartman Institute, which I believe is on your campus at JTS now. So they did the whole him-her thing, and that was like the first time that I had that question. So I think there's an important distinction here, which is what you're bringing up I don't think is Chil Hashem. I think it's actually Mipnei Eva, which is the concern that either non-Jews or fellow Jews you're going to cultivate enmity, you're going to cultivate derision toward yourself and toward the observant or religiously practicing community. What I would actually say is that the opposite is that we have here Mipnei Eva, but for you, if, again, the gender thing, I think actually is a discussion because, again, there is a minority halakhic opinion which recognizes transitional surgeries as effective. It might be usher actually to undergo the surgery due to genital mutilation, but once it's done, it might be recognized halakhically. But so what we might have here is Chil Hashem versus Mipnei Eva, because what would be a greater Chil Hashem than to capitulate to what society says instead of what the Torah wants? I would actually say that would be a Chil Hashem. That's how I would understand it, at least. But Mipnei Eva is also a halachic concern. That's the reason Ramosha Feinstein, many poskim say, if you're a Jewish doctor on Shabbos, don't think twice. If there's a non-Jewish patient, yeah, maybe technically, halachically, if there were no concerns, you would not be allowed to operate because only those who keep Shabbos are allowed to break Shabbos for them. But Mipnei Eva tells us even to do that. So the question is a separate discussion about how we quantify Mipnei Eva. And that is a legitimate discussion that needs to be had. But I don't want to just be the one answering the question here. I mean, what would you guys all say? This is not just about what I would answer. What would you all say in the situation that John is bringing up? Would it be a Chil Hashem?
Well, I have more like a general question on this point. So when the pasuk says, when psukim in general tell us to do something and kind of isolate it only to the Jewish people, like halachically, when it comes to when we're talking about mitzvos, yes, the halacha might only apply to, amiso, someone who's, v'havta l'reacha, someone who's a reacha. But that doesn't mean that it's kind of carte blanche. If they're not, Jewish, then you can kind of, bully them and this and that. Like, the Torah has to be taken like common sense as well. Like, yes, there's a halacha, there's a mitzvah, an added mitzvah, maybe you would say, for amiso and reacha, but that kind of that leap to, well, then it's okay if they're not, I think needs to kind of be reined in.
It does, and you're correct. So the poskim, let me just bring back up the source over here. We're not going to see so much inside, but if you look in Shas Chuvas Oznei Dabru, so he says maybe when it comes to a Jewish heretic, all bets are off, and you're more than welcome to do Ona'as Devarim you like. But when it comes to a non-Jew, very likely there's at least an Isser D'Rabbanan, a rabbinical prohibition, to speak Lashon Hara and presumably Ona'as Devarim toward them as well. So the point I bring up actually is he says, and this is a crazy, I don't mean crazy source, but if you want to walk home with a collector's item, as my Rebbe Rosavlovsky and Y used to call it, this is a collector's item of a source. He says over here, Aval Misha Pori, my love, Ol Machus Shemayim, Hua Din Kibehema, someone who throws off the yoke of heaven, they are treated like an animal. The Pshizat al Pi Din, Mutter L'Daber al Behema Lashon Hara B'Loshin Tanaim. Certainly you're allowed to speak Lashon Hara about an animal. Aval V'emes Yoser Gruba Mehema, but he's worse than an animal. The Ilu V'Behema Mitzad al Mutter Tzarachim Noah. When it comes to an animal, at least, just so you have good midos, you shouldn't speak badly about how an animal appears to you. But when it comes to this person, all bets are off, he says. And he's worse It's worse, a category lower than how we would relate to a non-Jew. At very least, there's a rabbinical prohibition to speak badly about or toward a non-Jew. So good. I don't want us to walk away thinking anyone who doesn't qualify as a fully, as part of the Jewish nation, it's open season on them. But his argument is that it might not be open season even on non-Jews, but when it comes to someone who's rejecting the yoke of heaven, his argument is that there might be a to'elis, a benefit to doing so. Anyway, I just want to say it's 9 o'clock, so I want to be sensitive. If anyone needs to log off now, please, by all means, feel welcome to log off. I don't want to be matriach the tzibur, and I'll just stay on for another minute or two if anyone has any further ha'aros or questions, and we'll connect it back to our initial scenario, okay? All right. So just back to the original scenario, based on what we saw. There's a scenario where there's a terminology that is not really of a ideologically charged nature. The good example that I thought of was special needs child versus child with special needs. It seems clear to me based on the source. These are just my own conclusions. You can tell me based on what we saw if you disagree, that someone who you're going to offend them, you're aware of it, but you don't intend, you have to accommodate that if it's going to cause them true harm. Someone who is arguing against the Torah and wants to use terminologies that recognize an ideology or practice against the Torah, that you do not accommodate. And we can talk about other factors in Mipnei Eva. But then there's just one other concern, one other factor, which is, sometimes I'm not automatically offended. It's not always visceral, but sometimes people choose to be offended by certain things. Meaning, if you call me, if you make fun of me or my family, I'm going to have an instinctive, visceral reaction to that. But sometimes people clutch their, the expression, clutch their pearls, clutch their neck, that's it, clutch their pearls. Or people try to, or virtue signaling, that's all the new terminology that's going around, where they try to make a scene out of feeling offended by something, but they're not truly offended. So I don't think that's Ona'as Devarim either, because the person, that's not you causing Ona'as Devarim to them, that's them causing it to themselves. And then, I forgot who brought up at the beginning, maybe it was Matt, who said that then, what did they do? Not only did they not actually feel Ona'as Devarim, they turn it around, and then they cause Ona'as Devarim to the person that used a term that they don't like. So it's not really Reuven is the culprit in the end of the day, but sometimes in these situations, an overly zealous Shimon winds up becoming the violator of Ona'as Devarim. So that's another factor that needs to be taken into consideration, which is it's not always like Shimon, the sense of Shimon is being harmed. No, sometimes Shimon chooses to feel harmed by that rather than it being an instinctive visceral reaction. It's not an insult toward him or his family. It's him choosing to put himself in that position to be offended by that. That's another important point. And I think sometimes in contemporary discourse, that's actually the scenario that's taking place. But I leave it up to you. If am I making a correct observation, or is that just me trying to validate the fact that I'm not going to accommodate every single word that someone wants me to say?
No, I think that's right. I think what you see people, like you going back to the example of the, you mentioned earlier, just the 39 lashes for this. In today's world, you could see people thinking to themselves, oh, I could really get that guy. He's gonna get 39 lashes if I just have a freak out and a meltdown. Even though like it bothered me a little bit, I could probably let it go. It's not the end of the world. But if I really like cause an uproar, that guy who like I have like other issues with some other thing and it has nothing to do with what he just said to me, I could really get him. And I feel like that's something it's almost like a cycle of violence in a sense, a cycle of harassment. Like he got me, I'll get him. He got me, I'll get him. And it's like, are you really that offended, or are you just trying to go after somebody for the sake of going after them?
100% agree, Eitan. And I think, this is what the Rambam means. No one else interprets it this way. This is my personal chiddush, so you can tell me if you see it in the words. He says, "Umish ma'anes atzmo muter lo niu." Someone who causes onah to himself, you're allowed to cause him onah. What does that mean? What? So if if I'm self-deprecating, that means someone else is allowed to ridicule me. I think maybe, I don't know, maybe it's just me being, again, anachronistic. I think what he might mean is that if Shimon chooses to act like he's being offended, he's causing Ona'ah to himself, you're allowed to use that word. That's not called real Ona'ah, because they're creating a scene where there doesn't need to be one. So,
Right.
that was my thought. Maybe that's the way to interpret the Ramah. There's actually 3 interpretations of that Ramah. None of it are what I just said, but I thought that might be a source that speaks to your point, Eitan. Okay, it's 9:05. It's also, and I know it's Thursday nights, and I appreciate you guys taking the time to meet. Sam and I will be in touch on the WhatsApp group. We want to make sure we find a time that works best for people, and God willing, so Sam got some refreshments for tonight. We'll have them for next time. We'll be in touch probably in 2 weeks from now, right?
Yeah,
Excellent.
and I think what's a good idea, I think if there's topics that, guys are interested in, they can, private message the rabbi, and talk through some topics, whether for if you want to work on them on your own or, kind of think them through with the rabbi. What do you think, Rabbi?
That sounds great. I put together a spreadsheet actually where people can put their names in for weeks that they want to either host or they want to give or do both. So all you got to do is put your name in there, and if Sam and I can be of any help, either vis-a-vis the logistics or vis-a-vis the presentation of the class, we're here for you in that respect. So I'm looking forward to learning from all the topics you guys have in store.
Excellent. Thanks,
All right.
guys. Thanks,
All right. Have
Rabbi.
a great night, everyone, and Yasher Kosh
Thank you.
for putting this together again.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you, Matt.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks, John. Good seeing you. Have a good night, Eitan and Sam.
Good night, everyone.
Josh and
Night.
Dan.